but I want to welcome you all to our third Connected Cities Street Network Design Meeting. And I'm just going to give you a little tour of what we're going to do tonight. So first, I'm going to give a background in case you weren't able to attend the first or the second meeting. I'm going to walk you through a little bit of how we got here and the information that we're going to see tonight. And we're going to talk about what's called travel demand modeling with the study that was completed by CDM Smith, our engineer. And we're going to talk about those network updates based on your input from the last two meetings. What have they culminated in, and what did those studies look like? What were the engineers doing as they were doing their travel demand modeling? We are going to look at each of the alternatives that were studied, again, based on your input, non-motorized travel, traffic lanes, sidewalks, and pedestrian networks. And then again, how did that culminate in through the modeling? And what were the successes, and where do we see room for improvement? When we look at the modeling results and what's called LOS, or level of service, we're going to make sure that you're all up to speed on all of that jargon, so everybody knows what level of service is and how that affects our traffic as well. And then lastly, what we're going to do is we're going to talk about the work session that we're going to do tonight. What are all of these boards that are around you? What are we asking for your input as well? And then what will our next steps be? So first, how did we get here? So again, if I take you all the way back to the 1960s, that was the first time the streets were converted to one-way. So in 1964, when the streets were converted, the first studies started to happen in the 70s about should we convert back to two-way, or did we need more one-way streets at that time? And so there were several plans done between 1970s and actually all the way up until 2010. And each of those only worked on what we call the Michigan Department of Transportation, or the state-owned streets. And it was at that time that the city chose to take those streets back from the state. And so now the city owns Michigan, Kalamazoo, Park, and Westnedge. So in terms of the network strategy that we couldn't study before, we are now able to incorporate all of the city streets as well as those formerly state-owned streets into the network demand modeling that you're going to see tonight. And then I'm going to have Katie talk to you about this round of meetings that we've had. So we started last fall.
Hi, everyone. So starting this fall, after we got control of all of the state-owned streets, we did a large community meeting to kick off, followed by a bike survey and walking audits, which I see a lot of familiar faces. So we all went out and walked along the streets. We talked about the experience, what was working, what wasn't working, mostly what wasn't working. And then we've also done some neighborhood meetings in neighborhoods that are most impacted by these streets, and there'll be some more neighborhood meetings coming up as well to talk about how Riverview impacts Eastside, how Westnedge and Park are impacting Vine, those conversations. And then we're here today to touch back with you guys. And so you'll see some of the recap of those efforts early on in the boards.
Thanks, Katie. So now we're going to hear from our engineer, Jeff Sangillo, from CDM Smith, and he's going to walk you through all of the data and modeling studies that were completed.
Thank you, Rebecca. So So the first thing is an overview of what is travel demand modeling. That's a term that Rebecca had mentioned, but basically what it is it's a computer software program for estimating travel behavior. So looking at a transportation network, the infrastructure that's out there or could be out there, and determining what trip activity would look like based on where people live, where jobs are, and how those become trips as part of people just moving around in a city. And it's based on a set of statistical analysis that estimates what is the average that way that people will be moving from between homes, jobs, and other places, based on that network. How can those individuals optimize their travel? So it's important to remember that it is a tool. It's a very useful tool, but it's just one part of the piece of the planning process, which also includes events like this and talking, to people who actually live in the city and have inside information and have a good idea of what's going on. So it can be used to help kind of inform us what some possibilities are, but it's not going to tell us everything. Our particular travel demand model. I'm sorry. Our particular travel demand model is closer. Is it not on? Was it not on for her? Or she's just louder? There we go. Okay. Oh, there we go. Our particular travel demand model is based on the CATS model. Are we okay now? Yeah. Okay. Which uses 2017 as the base year, and then also 2045 as a future year. So it's looking at what's going on today, or around today, and then what is going on, sometime in the future, so we can plan for the future. So as part of this process, we also did some additional traffic counts. So what the traffic look like out there now, to validate the model and to be able to look at a model and say, yes, this actually seems to represent what is happening in reality. Because as we know, it's just a computer program, so it could be off, but so validation is important. We also made a few modifications to what we're calling committed projects, because if we know some changes are going to take place, then we should account for those as well. So that includes connecting Harrison Street to Pitcher at the Level intersection with a roundabout. It also includes some updates to the to 131 and 131 business, and then also using the most recent land use available. So CATS has made some estimates for where they know development will happen, how will population change, where are jobs coming in. So we want to use that information to kind of reflect, especially as we look out to 2045, what we think is the most likely scenario to happen. So what we do then, once we kind of get all that information into our computer program, is we look at a KnowBuild model, is what we call it. And what that is what happens, what's going on out there now, and what also would happen in 2045 if we didn't do anything. So other than our committed projects. But what if we don't make any changes? And how does that look? And then what we can compare that to is different alternatives and say, all right, well, what happens if we do this, do that? How does that affect the results? We took a few alternatives that were developed during the Pell study, and then we've made some modifications based on talking to the city and also the feedback that we've heard throughout this meeting process to come up with 5 alternatives. So these include modifications to create a number of streets, creating 2 ways where there were 1 ways. There are also some more aggressive options where we reduce the number of lanes, for the opportunity to create ped and bike opportunities and more space for those users. So we can see what are the results of that, and are there places where this would be feasible for the city. So that could include parking removal, and we could look at those opportunities if those alternatives seem to make sense. And then, as Rebecca mentioned, this kind of all is rated based on level of service. And what level of service is is it's a kind of standard traffic engineering metric that is used to assess the expected performance on a particular roadway segment. And it's actually labeled from A to F, just A, B, C, D, E, F, similar to grades you get in school, and based on how stable is the traffic flow, how much delay, how based on what as compared to free flow conditions. Some levels are considered stable, and we're going to call those acceptable. So if you see, on the boards over there or in some of the maps I'm going to show, during peak periods, which is kind of what we plan for, what happens in the afternoon peak, are these segments in this alternative, are they stable and fairly uncongested? Is it reasonable to travel there? Or are they unstable? And, gridlock may happen, traffic is really bad, the lanes are operating at overcapacity, and we call that unacceptable. Now, there really isn't a scenario where you're going to have where everything's going to be perfect, where it's going to be stable and uncongested everywhere. So it's about looking and making trade-off and deciding, okay, what kind can we live with as a city? So we ran these results, and we found that ultimately Kalamazoo has many viable options for its downtown street network, and so this can be leveraged to positively impact a variety of users. So if you look at kind of some of the results here, these are key locations, and you see the level of service. So as I said, those level of service rated E through F, and you really see there's only a couple of areas where you're seeing E's and F's, which are really the letters that we want to avoid, because keep in mind, again, this is just during the peak period, so we're planning for kind of the worst case scenario on the average day. But this will give you a sense of where some of the problem spots would be under the different scenarios. This is another way to kind of look at it here. So the black lines are acceptable under the no build in all scenarios. So you see that in 2019, things are going fairly well, and there's just a few areas where under either the no build or the different scenarios that are hotspots where there are E's or F's, and there really is kind of a breakdown of additional congestion there, and it would be something that would be a problem area. Now, again, every city has problem areas. 2045, you'll see there's a few more problem areas, which is to be expected based on just kind of growth in population, growth in employment, and the corresponding growth in traffic that occurs. So just to kind of summarize, we looked at these different alternatives at a high level. We kind of understand what level of service is now, and we built these alternatives based on kind of coming up with some ideas that are things that the city is interested in doing, but also provide for an acceptable level of service on most streets. Not everywhere, but what are the changes that we can make to benefit all users. However, we recognize that there are going to be trade-offs. So that's why it's important to get feedback from the community. Which are the streets that we really want to focus on making changes to? Which are the streets that we want to keep as they are? Where are the hot spots that we think we can live with? Where are ones that we need to avoid? So the next part of kind of our process is to get some feedback from you, additional feedback from the city, and ultimately a determination on what our preferred alternative would be moving forward. So we can conduct some additional analysis to look at those hotspots in a little more detail, come up with some additional metrics where we look at things like what would the impact of turn lanes be, or removing parking, some of those trade-offs in more detail. And I want to highlight again, it's still just a preferred alternative. It is not a decision on anything to move forward. So additional analysis is required. We want to continue to work with the community for that. but just trying to carve out a path forward. Thank you.
So as Jeff talked about carving a path forward, that's what we want to hear from you tonight. So as he talked about some of these trade-offs and the problem areas that we can discuss as well, we have boards for each of the major roads within the network around the room, starting with Kalamazoo Avenue and Michigan, South, Level, Stadium, and then Riverview Drive. In each of these scenarios, it's given you room and a question. So if you were to, for example, in one of the alternatives, Kalamazoo Avenue was road dieted or shrunk from 5 lanes to 3 lanes. And we know that traffic can work with 2 lanes, 1 travel lane in each direction, and a center left turn lane. And so when you have the extra room, and you can have parking, and you can have bike lanes, and you could have a wider sidewalk, what would you choose? And so each of these boards has those questions for you. So on South Street, for example, if you think about South Street further west towards Stadium Drive, what does that look like? And what would you propose for that part of the street? And then as the context changes and you get into town, as you come to Park and Westnedge and you've got Bronson Park and you're heading into the downtown, then what does South Street look like as you have 3 lanes? How would you allocate the traffic there? How would you think about those lanes being proposed there? And so the same question is asked for Michigan and for Level, South, etc. And so that's where we're asking for your help tonight to think about what are those trade-offs and in what part of the street would you like to see those changes? What parts of the street would you like to see stay the same? And then as we think about what's going to happen at the next meeting is we're going to be incorporating your thoughts and your ideas from this input, and that's when we're going to start looking at the more finer grained design. What does the signal timing look like? What does that, do we need a better right turn lane, or do we need a dedicated left turn lane? Those types of modeling scenarios will be our next fine grain tuning as we get more input from you about what you'd like to see. And then as we see those designs come to kind of more fine tuning, then we want to start putting a budget together. We want to understand what is the cost. What is the cost when you ask for a protected bike lane, or when you ask us for a wider sidewalk, or things like that? What's the budget going to look like? Because if we can't assign budget to us, I mean, we see this as we want this to move forward. I mentioned we've been planning this since the 1970s, so we really, really like to be able to come together on a design alternative and a budget, and so that we can really start to look at seeking grant funding opportunities to make this a reality for our community. So all of our staff is available. We all have volunteer tags. So please, this is your time to have us one-on-one and be able to talk to us about what your thoughts and ideas are for this network. And we want to thank you ahead of time for joining us.